What if I told you that a soccer match literally started a war? Not hooligans throwing bottles, not angry fans fighting in parking lots. I'm talking about actual tanks rolling across borders, fighter jets dropping bombs, thousands of people dying, all because of a World Cup qualifying match. This is the insane true story of the 100-hour war, when El Salvador invaded Honduras because they lost a soccer game. To understand how a soccer match could spark an actual war, we need to go back to 1969 Central America, where things were already a complete disaster. Picture this. El Salvador, one of the smallest countries in Latin America, was bursting at the seams. The population was exploding, but all the good land belonged to just 14 families. Literally, 14 families controlled 60% of the entire country. So what did desperate Salvadoran peasants do? They crossed into Honduras looking for work on banana plantations. By 1969, over 300,000 Salvadorans were living illegally in Honduras. That's 1 out of every 5 people in Honduras. Imagine if 60 million undocumented immigrants showed up in the United States overnight. But here's where it gets sinister. Honduras had its own military dictator, General Oswaldo López Arellano, who was feeling the heat from his own starving population. So he played the oldest trick in the dictator playbook: blame the foreigners. López announced land reform, which sounds nice until you realize it meant seizing land from Salvadoran immigrants and giving it to Honduran peasants. Basically, ethnic cleansing with a fancy name. Meanwhile, El Salvador's oligarchy was terrified their own people would revolt. They needed a distraction. They needed an enemy. And then FIFA scheduled World Cup qualifying matches between El Salvador and Honduras. Both dictators saw blood in the water. The first match was June 8, 1969 in Tegucigalpa, Honduras. As the Salvadoran national anthem played, Honduran fans burned Salvadoran flags, threw rotten fruit, and held up nooses. The message was clear: go home or die. But El Salvador shocked everyone by winning 3-2. That's when the propaganda machine kicked into overdrive. Honduran radio claimed a heartbroken Salvadoran girl committed suicide after watching her team lose. Salvadoran media fired back, saying Honduran fans had tortured Salvadoran visitors. None of this was true. But truth doesn't matter when you're manufacturing consent for war. The return match in San Salvador was even worse. Honduran players needed police escorts just to leave their hotel. The stadium was surrounded by 5,000 troops. El Salvador won again, 3-0. But the real violence was happening off the field. State-controlled media on both sides spread increasingly vicious lies. Hondurans are poisoning our water. Salvadorans are raping our women. They're stealing our children. Radio stations became weapons of mass destruction, broadcasting pure hatred 24/7. The third and deciding match was scheduled for Mexico City, neutral ground. But by then, it was too late. July 14, 1969, 5 a.m. Without warning, the Salvadoran Air Force, all 12 planes of it, crossed into Honduras and started bombing. But here's the crazy part. El Salvador's Air Force was flying World War II, era P-51 Mustangs and some crop dusters with bombs duct-taped underneath. It sounds almost comical until you remember people were dying. Salvadoran ground troops poured across 3 different border points, advancing 8 miles into Honduras in just 24 hours. For a tiny country with a military smaller than most police departments, this was lightning warfare. But the real horror wasn't the battles. It was what happened to civilians. Honduras had virtually no air force, so they started bombing their own villages and blaming El Salvador. Classic false flag operations. At the same time, 100,000 Hondurans of Salvadoran descent fled toward the border, creating massive refugee columns. At one bridge over the Lempa River, panicked families trampled each other to death. Children were crushed underfoot. Meanwhile, in San Salvador, crowds gathered in the streets cheering as state television showed fake footage of glorious victories. The government claimed they'd destroyed the entire Honduran Air Force. The truth? Honduras only had 6 planes to begin with. For 100 hours, Central America went insane. Both sides committed atrocities that would make your stomach turn. Salvadoran troops executed Honduran peasants. Honduran militias massacred anyone who looked Salvadoran, which often meant anyone who was poor. The Organization of American States finally forced a ceasefire after exactly 100 hours of carnage. The official death toll? Around 3,000. The real death toll? Nobody knows because both governments were lying about everything. Here's the most disgusting part. While thousands of people died, both dictators achieved exactly what they wanted. López Arellano used the war to portray himself as a patriotic defender, crushing internal opposition. El Salvador's oligarchy successfully redirected their people's anger away from inequality toward Honduras. And that World Cup qualifier that started it all, El Salvador lost to Haiti in the next round anyway. You might think this story ends with the ceasefire. You'd be wrong. The 300,000 Salvadoran refugees created by this war didn't just disappear, they radicalized. Some joined leftist guerrilla movements that would tear El Salvador apart in a civil war lasting 12 years and killing 75,000 people. Others formed criminal organizations in refugee camps. Ever heard of MS-13? Yeah, their origins trace back to displacement from the football war. The same border that exploded in 1969 is still a crisis zone today. Modern migrant caravans flee the same violence, the same poverty, created by the same oligarchs who use soccer as an excuse for war. And here's the final, sick irony. FIFA continued the World Cup qualifiers as if nothing happened. The 1970 World Cup in Mexico went on as planned, with corporate sponsors celebrating the beautiful game, while refugees still lived in camps. The football war proves that sports are never just games when powerful people need scapegoats. From Rwanda's genocide radio using soccer metaphors to Qatar's World Cup built on migrant deaths, the pattern repeats. When societies are ready to explode, sports become the fuse. So, next time someone tells you to keep politics out of sports, remember the 100 hours when a soccer match became an excuse for ethnic cleansing. Because somewhere, some dictator is watching the game and planning the next war. Don't forget to subscribe for more hidden history that'll blow your mind.